The 0127-4/6 set and the 0157-4/16 set are both included in the 01257-514 set, and that projects itself across the deepest background of the first movement, accumulating itself downward, fixed in register, one element at a time, until the fully realized set occurs at a moment of culmination. Time does not permit a full discussion about the thorny issue as to whether this background constitutes prongs that are truly prolongational in nature or merely associative. Ultimately, even if these are associations and not prolongations, the broader point remains. The piece is structurally unified at a background level by some of the same sets that assert salience at the foreground. Time also does not permit an accounting of the designation of each background pitch of each of the 5 movements as hierarchical. But I should say that I employ Jack Boss's 9 criteria for the distinction between structural and non-structural pitches to extricate those that I believe are hierarchically superior. Anyone interested in a more detailed blow-by-blow of my reasoning should feel free to get in touch. I will say of my head tone that A is the only thrice represented pitch class in the first measure, with A5 as an axis of symmetry between A4 and A6. I've made a short excerpt in which you can actually hear these moments from the Concord Quartet studio recording. First, you'll hear each background prong played with samples by a sequencer to acclimate your ears to what you're listening for. Then, you'll hear the example from the actual Concord Quartet recording. I will say of the culminating 5/12 sonority, which I call a structural pentad, the moment itself occurs in a culminating place in the movement. It is the greatest dynamic recession of the movement, coming down from fortissimo in measures 125 to 127 to piano and pianissimo in measure 131. It is introduced by a heraldic thrice-repeated D sharp in measure 128, and a reminiscence of G sharp 2 occurs in measure 129, which resolves upward to A sharp 2. The second movement, which bears important resemblances to the fourth movement, evokes a Bartokian aesthetic. Like the first movement, the first measure of the second movement, in amalgam, also asserts the salient tetrads in various combinations. This brings me to the subject of modular transformation, an analytical tool developed by Matthew Santa, who deploys it in the analysis of Bartók, among others. The idea is that a given set, say 0127, can be applied to the scale steps of a given chromatic scale, octatonic scale, diatonic scale, whole tone scale, or pentatonic scale, and then compared. This allows for the comparison of sets that occur despite radical aesthetic shifts. It is an idea Rochberg himself may have presaged when he observed, quote, "It seems more likely to be true than not that tonal and atonal music are forms of musical thinking that are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but are, in fact, large-scale transformations of the same forces at work in both." Here is a table of the ways in which the salient sets map onto one another in different harmonic landscapes. The arrows indicate sets related by a common intermediary. This is particularly relevant to the second movement, where 0147 is prominent as the set that appears 8 ways in the first measure of the movement, and 0146 is a structural culmination. These are also the most obvious sets of movement 2, measure 1. They are related through octatonic chromatic modular transformation, which should be no surprise given a movement that invokes a Bartokian aesthetic. The background is a more complex network of interlocking cumulative projections, in this case devoted to 3 salient sets. The third movement, of course, is where the controversy really began. One assumes this is a tonal movement, and as such, an orthodox prolongational approach, such as Schenkerian analysis, might be appropriate. When we assume the piece is tonal, then the series of harmonies built on minor ninths, beginning late in the movement at measure 120, are dissonant, ancillary, and require resolution, and the harmonies dutifully resolve. What if this resolution is merely a surface phenomenon? What if the minor ninth dissonances are actually the intended structural culmination of the movement at some deeper background level? Notice that they are all tetradic. Indeed, some of the same salient tetrads we've seen in the first 2 movements. This would test the premise of ars combinatoria. If these dissonances can be shown to accumulate in the same manner as the structural post-tonal harmonies of the first 2 movements, then this shows that ars combinatoria is a viable organizing principle. The third movement would be a movement of dual identity, seemingly tonal on the surface, but not necessarily tonal in the deepest background, a truly postmodern and, I might add, progressive accomplishment. Here it is. I choose 418 as the background set because of its intricate lattice of voice exchanges with other salient harmonies that occur at obvious structural fissures in the movement. Notice that the structural dyad and structural triad are also dissonant, occurring at significant structural points in the work, despite the surface impression of tonality. Also notice that 037, that hallmark of tonality, is a subset of 0147, 418. Perhaps all the triadic material of the movement could be considered incomplete manifestations of 0147, despite the surface impression of tonality. Here then is the excerpted background.